The artist I chose to do my presentation on is Matthew B. Brady. Brady was born in 1823 at Lake George, New York, and he died January 15th, 1896 at New York. To give you guys some background information on the artist that I chose, the first point is that he was most known for his portraits of famous people and photos of the Civil War. In fact, he is known for taking many portraits of many famous people throughout the years and was actually the first person to take photos of any war. The time of his life that he spent working was from approximately 1844 to 1873, and he's actually one of the pioneers of photography, being like one of the first really famous people for, especially for the famous portraits and pictures of the Civil War that I mentioned earlier. To give you guys an idea of whereabouts he worked out of, he had studios in New York and in Washington, but taking photos of the Civil War and taking portraits of multiple different famous people required that he travel all over the United States. One interesting thing to note about Brady is that his plan to photograph the Civil War eventually led him into bankruptcy because he put so much money into this project, and at the time there wasn't a demand for any photos, so the government wasn't willing to pay him nearly as much as he put in to the project. So he was actually bankrupt when he passed away, and it wasn't until much later that his photos were actually appreciated by most of the American culture. The style of photography that Brady used was titled a daguerreotype. I know I wasn't very familiar with it before I started this project, so I thought I'd provide you guys a picture of it here and just give you guys kind of an idea of what Brady was really working with when he took all these portraits and famous pictures that you'll see coming up here. Now I'm going to get into showing you guys some examples of the work that Brady did throughout his career. The first example I have here is a picture of Edgar Allan Poe. Edgar Allan Poe is a famous American writer, most commonly known for his dark-styled poetry. Next, I have a photo of Abraham Lincoln, who was the 16th President of the United States, and he was the president during the time of the Civil War. I think it's important to acknowledge that although Abraham Lincoln is one of the most famous American icons through all disciplines, that some of Brady's photos of him are actually his most famous photos ever taken, so I think that's pretty important to acknowledge. The next portrait I have here is a picture of Franklin Douglass. Franklin Douglass was very important in the civil rights movements, being that he's an escaped slave who made his way to the more northern United States and eventually was able to fight for the rights of other slaves. So Franklin Douglass is just another example of an iconic American that Brady was able to photograph. That concludes the segment of this presentation that's going to look at the portraits that Brady took, but now we're going to move into more of the photos that he took from the Civil War. This photo shown is arguably Brady's most famous photo, and as you can see, it's a picture of an American soldier who has fallen in war with his rifle sitting on his chest. Photos like these are clearly not easy to look at, but I think they're extremely important in that they show us what these men really went through and what they fought, or what their fight looked like in order for America to be in the state it is today. This photograph is a picture of an ambulance from the Civil War times. I think this picture is important because it shows us just how far we've come with not only technology and having ambulances that are fully loaded with all sorts of medical equipment, but also gives us an idea of just how many people were needed in order to treat the wounded. In this picture you can see multiple different people coming off the ambulance to help load these fallen soldiers or injured soldiers onto the wagon, and nowadays I don't think you would need quite as many people to help. This is a photograph of sort of a pop-up church that was put up at one of the bases during the Civil War. And I think this picture is really interesting because it shows just how devoted these men were to go to church whenever they could. And you can see that it's literally packed there, everybody's shoulder to shoulder. It's like 2 lines deep. So I think this picture is really interesting to see just how many of these men were still, even in the middle of a massive war, were still able to go to church when they could. Here in this photo, you can see a group of army men walking down the street with some civilians watching on the sides. And the reason I chose this picture wasn't so much for the content, but I thought it was really interesting the angle that Brady was able to get. You can see that he is much higher than most of these civilians pictured on the bottom there, and I think it just goes to show that he was, although he was photographing famous people, he was still had some skill and was able to find these different angles that make the pictures look really nice. This photo here shows Abraham Lincoln at one of the war camps wearing his iconic top hat. A picture like this is important to note because it shows that Abraham Lincoln was really out in the war. He didn't just sit in the White House, didn't sit back. He was out in the trenches, maybe not fighting, but still you could tell that he was out there at these war camps. This photo is another one that's pretty hard to look at, but I think it's important to include because it shows just how much loss was involved in this war, and in my opinion, it makes things a little more real than just hearing about it. I thought this photo was interesting because it's one of the only photos that's truly staged, where the majority of the people here are looking at the camera. And another thing is I think it's a good visual just to realize how many people are actually on one of these boats to make things run so smoothly the way they did. I know I never would have had a clue as to just how many people it takes to run one of these boats, but I think this picture does a really good job of showing you how many people it took to run one of these boats. My last slide here, I just want to leave you guys with a few things to remember about Brady. The first thing is that he was actually one of the first people to document war using photography. And this may not seem like a massive thing, but I think it makes the war a lot more real than just hearing about it and hearing about these battles when you can actually see photographs taken from the different places. It makes it a lot more real, and you can see the tragedy that people really went through during that time. The second thing I want to leave you guys with is that Brady was one of the first people to take portraits of influential people. This one may not seem like a huge deal, but I do think it's kind of cool to be able to look back and see what someone like Abraham Lincoln or Edgar Allan Poe actually look like instead of just hearing stories about them and what they did for the country. These 2 reasons I just mentioned were 2 of the main reasons that I chose Brady as my artist to do for this project, and I just want to thank you guys for listening.